Transitioning briefly to some of the events that are going on in the world, you, of course, have specialized in the Middle East, and it's been a very exciting and tumultuous period for the region over the last 2 years. And I was wondering, looking forward over the next 10 to 20 years, what worries you the most about the Middle East?
Well, I think, we had a very hopeful opening in the Arab Spring in 2011, but it also has exposed many of the deeper problems in the region, which we knew were there, but they were not in the acute or exposed manner that we find them. Issues of lack of economic development, weak political institutions, deep-seated ethnic and sectarian tensions. These were all there, but now they are out in the open, and they're out in the open in an environment where the Arab Spring has created for a much more assertive society and weaker states and a greater competition for winning the future. So how these conflicts actually unfold and the manner in which they could either be a force for good or alternately precipitate conflicts and crises that would become problematic for the Western world. Those are the things that worry me. I don't see a very clear direction in the region. I don't see a very straight path for a major country to go from an authoritarian, sclerotic economy to a sort of prosperous democratic future. And this in-between period is fraught with risk and difficulty.
And I guess in speaking from a U.S. policy standpoint, how do you think history will judge the intervention in Libya? And then going beyond that, do you think that the U.S. and Western decision to intervene in Libya, do you think that that's negatively affecting our chances of a more favorable outcome in Syria because of, say, the Chinese and Russian example at the UN? And what impact do you think that decision has had on the future of the Arab Spring and the U.S.'s ability to respond to different developments?
Well, something that is unique about the Arab world is that we always deal with series of things. When you intervened in Bosnia, it was only Bosnia. But Libya is not an isolated case. It's happening alongside other candidates for intervention: Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, any other country that's going to come online. And because the Arab world is connected to one another, you're going to have this problem that what you do in one country immediately becomes a precedent for another one, because you're dealing with the same set of events and in the same part of the world. But I think you can look at Libya in two ways. One is the actual act of intervention, the way in which it was done, how the UN was galvanized, how the mission was carried out. And you could say in that narrow window of that decision, it was a winning decision. It did save Benghazi from a humanitarian disaster. It did bring down the Gaddafi regime, and it also was a case of successful international consensus building and alliance building between Arab League, United Nations, and NATO to carry out the mission. But there is a broader issue, is that what are the consequences of a policy? And that I think we'll have to see, let's say 10 years from now, where Libya is. I don't think anybody is going to look back and say that we should have kept Gaddafi there. But the real question becomes as to whether the period of intervention should have been followed by a period of keeping the peace on the ground. And this is a big difference between Bosnia and Libya, is that in Bosnia you still have NATO troops on the ground. It's more, close to 2 decades later. Whereas in Libya you have absolutely none of those people who fought Gaddafi and got rid of him having any presence on the ground. And I think that from the day Gaddafi died onwards is really where the legacy of that mission is going to be judged. I think prior to that is much more straightforward. And yes, Libya does raise a series of important questions. There are many countries around the world that have within their belly, they have unresolved ethnic, sectarian, racial, communal issues. And they are very skittish about establishing an international precedent for outside intervention. And therefore, they're not, the vote they give at the United Nations is not really about Syria. It's about themselves. And in Libya, they saw how quickly a humanitarian intervention was used by the United Nations to be translated into regime change. And that's what they worry about. They're not opposed to humanitarian intervention per se. They're really opposed to the regime change part. And this is true of many other things at the United Nations. I mean, once the United Nations ends up in giving resolutions, the resolutions can be interpreted broadly to lay the foundation for future resolutions. And I think that's why you see the greatest fighting right at the moment of the first resolution, because that really opens the floodgates.
You've spoken in the past about Gaddafi's decision to relinquish his WMD program and how that made it significantly more easy for NATO and the US to intervene. And I was wondering how much you think that decision and the US and the ultimate US decision in Libya, how much that plays in the minds of the Iranian leaders when they come to the negotiating table with the West on the nuclear issue, and if that makes them much more hesitant to ever give up the kind of capabilities that they've developed, unconventional weapons capabilities and nuclear capabilities.
It's definitely there because we've seen them make references to it, including even the supreme leader in Iran made references to it when Gaddafi gave it up. He thought that was a mistake, and the Iranians have referred to it on and off. So we know it's there. You know, countries want WMD often for deterrence purposes, and the most obvious reason for deterrence in our eyes is to prevent war being waged on them by another country, particularly one that has WMD capability itself. But Libya shows that there's another sort of intervention or war that threatens them, and that's that if and when they have a domestic dispute, the international community can intervene to settle that dispute. This has happened in the past. For instance, in 1971, India intervened to help Bangladesh separate from Pakistan. So one reason the Pakistanis got the bomb was to prevent India from doing that again, fully well knowing there are additional ethnic tensions within Pakistan's boundaries that could lead India to intervene to break up Pakistan further. So Libya also showed that Libya didn't need a bomb in order to prevent Egypt or Tunisia or Algeria from invading it. It really needed it to prevent NATO from intervening. And I think the Iranian government from the very early on thought about WMD, about nuclear weapons, because it had an experience of the Iran-Iraq war in which Iraq invaded Iran, occupied Iranian territory, and then eventually used the WMD against Iran, chemical weapons against Iran. So that was the reason they started the program. But as they've gone further in, there is this lingering fear that the United States and the West is really interested in regime change, and also may look at ethnic tensions, the Green Movement, any internal challenge to the Iranian government as a way of bringing about that regime change. So in their mind, there is a second deterrence. There is deterrence against Iraq or any other local neighbor who might want to invade Iran, but there's also a value of keeping the outside world out of your domestic disputes. Now, the sanctions is likely to actually increase the likelihood of an uprising in Iran, because it's weakening the economy, it is weakening state institutions. It may make it more likely that you would have even a more effective either pro-democracy or an ethnic rebellion in Iran. And therefore, there is more likelihood in the mind of the Iranian government of the possibility of a Libya scenario. Now, we have to see what kind of a lesson will come out of Syria as to whether Syria will undo the Libya example, but that remains to be seen.
And do you think, with respect to the U.S.'s, approach to Iran, do you think that there's too much of a focus on the nuclear issue, whether because of domestic politics or because of the legacy of U.S. policy up until now? Do you think that the U.S. would be better served to try to focus on more of a comprehensive diplomatic breakthrough with Iran, or is that just simply impossible because of domestic political factors before the election and so on?
Well, a comprehensive breakthrough with Iran is much more long run It's much more difficult, and it requires much more patient diplomacy. But whereas the nuclear issue is now viewed as an imminent threat, right or wrong, it's seen as an issue that the administration has to deal with right now. And much of the attention on Iran is because of the nuclear issue, not because of a need to bring Iran in from the cold. So here is actually a case where what you might have as a broader academic conceptual thinking about a problem is different from the way in which the policymakers approach it. So for them there is a particular deadline. This deadline is driven either by something a UN resolution says, or the IAEA says, or foreign leaders tell the United States, or the US Congress tells the administration that they have this timeline to deal with this specific problem. So the way the policymakers are approaching this is that, look, my problem is not to solve Iran as a whole. That would be a good to have. My problem is how to stop enrichment by November, right? So then everything becomes focused on it. Of course it's a mistake in the longer scheme of things to focus the entire strategic perspective on a country of 80 million, given where it's located, given its capabilities and influence on the region, on a single issue. And you can even make an argument that actually complicates it further. But that's the reality of policymaking. That's the real world. That people are focused on solving a problem because that particular issue is a problem. And given how many other things are on policymakers' plates, they don't really put all of their energy and resources into an issue unless it's a big problem.
So I'd like to just switch gears quickly and talk about Pakistan. You've written recently, and of course this was a major part of your portfolio when you're working with Ambassador Holbrooke, but you've written recently about how there are some signs that the military is being weakened internally inside of Pakistan, and there may be some movement towards democracy, towards elections and greater transparency. And I'm wondering, again, in this situation, would the U.S. be wise to not focus as much just simply on security issues and try to engage Pakistan on a broader level? And is this movement towards democracy, the ascent of Imran Khan and other issues inside of Pakistan, is that a favorable trend for U.S. policy, or is there just a lot of uncertainty and we have to see how it all plays out?
Well, we have to see how it plays out. I mean, Pakistan is a very complicated country. There are positives in Pakistan and there are also huge negatives in Pakistan. We see, much more economic activity. We see greater trade with India, but also, you have a very weak economy. You have domestic political tensions, you have ethnic conflict, all of those issues. We have a lot at stake in Pakistan. Its instability will hurt the United States greatly. It's a nuclear armed country in a very strategic area of the world. And I think generally it is a mistake to focus on a very, very narrow issue with Pakistan. Largely, our conversations in Pakistan is that we want to talk about the one thing that matters to us, and we don't want to talk about the host of other things that matters to you. And I think that generally is a counterproductive approach.